Most of the sailors who crossed the warm, green waters your kind, once called the Spanish Main, would have told you, without hesitation, and with the particular certainty of beings who have never once checked a thing they believe, that La Misericordia was the most heavily gunned ship ever to ride that sea. They would have described her low and broad and bristling, her decks crowded with iron, her hold so full of silver that she sat deep in the water like a beast too gorged to flee. They would have sworn that the pirates who haunted those islands feared her the way smaller predators fear the largest one, because she could open them at the waterline and watch them sink. It is one of the more instructive habits of your species that the explanation you reach for first is almost always the loudest one. You see a thing that is feared, and you assume it must be feared for the reason that fear is usually purchased: force, mass, the capacity to end. I have spent a length of time studying your records that you would find difficult to hold in your minds, and I have come to expect this. We who keep the long archives are slow by your measure. A single one of my own recollections may stretch across more of your generations than any human captain ever commanded. And from that slowness a certain clarity arrives, the way sediment clears when the water finally stops moving. The clarity is this: the story your sailors told themselves about La Misericordia was wrong in every particular except the fear, and the fear was the only part they could not invent, because the fear was real and they had all felt it. I will tell you what is actually written in the records that survive, the ones your own people kept and then, in the way of your people, mostly forgot. In 19 years upon that water, under the command that made her famous, La Misericordia never sank a single pirate vessel. She never sent a crew to the bottom. She never burned a ship to the waterline or hanged a man from her yards or left a body floating for the gulls. The most dreaded ship on the Spanish Main, the one whose colors emptied the courage out of hardened men, did not kill. What men feared aboard her was not her guns. It was a book. And to understand why a book could do to grown and violent men what a broadside could not, you have to understand first the world that made the book necessary, and the woman who understood that world better than anyone living in it. The sea those men sailed was not, whatever your romances suggest, a lawless emptiness. It was an economy. I find this is the detail your storytellers always blur, because lawlessness is more thrilling to contemplate than bookkeeping. But the truth is that piracy in those decades was an organized commercial enterprise with its own ports, its own financiers, its own brokers who fenced stolen silver through respectable houses, and its own grim social order in which every man knew precisely what he was worth. The confederacies that prowled the islands were not mobs. They were firms. They had articles of agreement, schedules of shares, pensions paid in coin to men maimed in the work. A captain held his fleet not by terror alone but by reputation, by the demonstrated capacity to take prizes and divide them fairly and frighten the next victim into surrender without the expense of a fight. In such a world, the single most valuable thing a man could own was not his ship or his sword or even his life. It was his name. A name that frightened was a name that made other men yield, and a man whose name made others yield rarely had to spend blood to be rich. The whole machine ran on reputation the way your engines run on fire. And the most valuable name on that water, for the better part of a decade, belonged to a man called Elias Marsh. I have read everything that reached the archives concerning him, and I confess the figure that emerges is almost monotonous in its success. He was not, by the testimony even of those who hated him, a cruel man for cruelty's sake. Cruelty for its own sake is a luxury, and Marsh was an economist of fear. He understood that a single town sacked thoroughly and spoken of widely would deliver him a dozen towns that surrendered at the rumor of his sales. He took prizes without firing when he could, because powder was expensive and dead men paid no ransom, and he had grown so practiced at the arithmetic of dread that the mere sight of his flag was usually enough. He had never been beaten. More to the point, in the only sense that mattered in that world, he had never been made to look small. His name had never once been spoken with anything other than fear, and a man like that comes, over the years, to believe that his name is a kind of armor that no weapon in the world can pierce. He was correct about every weapon. He had simply never met a book. La Misericordia came into the story, as the silver galleons usually did, as a target. She was a treasure ship, a fat, slow vessel of the king's commerce, exactly the sort of prize Marsh's confederacy existed to take. And when one of his lieutenants, a hard, ambitious man the records named Tobias Crane, sighted her riding alone and apparently undermanned off the islands, he did what any of them would have done. He gave chase. He ran up alongside. He poured his boarders over her rail, expecting the brief, ugly business of a treasure ship surrender. And he found himself, within the space of an hour, sitting at a long table in the great cabin, disarmed, unhurt, and being offered wine. I want you to sit with the strangeness of that the way the men who lived it had to, because the strangeness is the entire point. Crane had boarded perhaps 30 ships in his career, and every one of them had resolved into one of two outcomes he understood completely: a fight that he won, or a surrender that he accepted. There was no third door in his world. And here was a woman, for the captain of La Misericordia was a woman, Capitana Iniacutes del Carpio, and the fact of a woman commanding a king's galleon was itself so far outside what Crane's mind was built to hold that he reportedly kept waiting for her to fetch the real captain. Here was a woman who had let his men board, had let them think for several minutes that they were winning, and had then closed a trap so quietly and so completely that not a shot was fired and not a man was killed, and who now sat across from him pouring wine as though he were a guest who had arrived a little early for dinner. She did not threaten him. This is the detail every account agrees upon and the detail that mattered most. She told him, in the unhurried voice of someone explaining the weather, that he and his men would not be harmed, that they would eat and rest, and that in the morning they would be put ashore alive, with their lives and their freedom but with nothing else, no plunder, no weapons, no ship. Crane's vessel she kept, and one thing more, which she described as the only part of the arrangement that was permanent. Her purser, a precise and watchful man named Mateo Reyes, would write down each man's name, not for ransom, not for any list of the wanted to be handed to the king's hangman, simply written down in a great bound book she kept in the cabin, beside the date and the place and a single line recording exactly what had happened, that on this day these men had boarded La Misericordia certain of an easy prize and had been spared. Spared. The word itself was the wound, though Crane did not understand that yet. He understood it on the long, humiliating row to shore, and he understood it completely by the time he reached a port and tried to explain to other men of the trade how he had lost a ship and a crew and taken nothing, and yet come home untouched. Because there is no version of that story a feared man can tell that leaves his fearsomeness intact. To have died fighting her would have been a kind of glory. To have been beaten bloody and ransomed would at least have been a defeat in the ordinary coin of the trade. But to have been fed and spared and written into a book like a child's misdeed in a parish register, that was something the language of those men had no honorable word for, and a thing that has no honorable name cannot be told as anything but shame. This was the whole of it. This was the entire engine of the legend, assembled in a single afternoon, though it would take years for the world to feel its full weight. Iniacutes del Carpio had understood, with the cold clarity that I have only ever otherwise seen in a handful of your kind across all the centuries I have watched, that in a world where reputation was capital, the most devastating thing you could do to a feared man was not to kill him. Killing him only confirmed his fearsomeness. A man who dies hard becomes a story that frightens others. The truly ruinous thing was to take his fear away and give him nothing in its place, to make the encounter with him boring, to survive him so easily and treat him so gently that the survival itself became an argument that he had never been worth fearing at all. She did not break her enemies' bodies. She broke the only thing that made them dangerous, which was the belief in other men that they were to be feared, and she kept the proof in a book. What followed across the next several years has the quality, in the records, of a slow tide coming in, no single dramatic wave, only the steady, undeniable rise. La Misericordia took pirates the way other ships took on water, quietly and continuously, and every man she took went into the ledger and came out a smaller legend than he had been. There was a brute called Adam Falk who had once held an entire harbor town to ransom for a week, and who, after an hour in Del Carpio's cabin and a night spared, and a morning set ashore in his shirt, found that the town he had terrorized now laughed when his name was spoken, because the story of the great Falk being fed soup by the Misericordia woman had traveled faster than any of his threats ever had. There was a Confederacy captain named Whitlock who, on sighting her colors at a distance, is recorded to have come about and fled, not from her guns, which he could not even see at that range, but from the simple, unbearable arithmetic that a fight he won would cost him men, and a fight he lost would cost him his name, and there was no outcome on that water that improved his standing, only outcomes that diminished it. The most feared ship on the Main had made fighting her a losing proposition even in victory, and men began to do the only rational thing, which was to avoid her, and avoidance is its own kind of confession. The ledger grew thick. I have tried, in my slow way, to imagine the object as those men imagined it, and I think the truest thing I can tell you is that the book became, in the minds of the men who sailed that sea, something closer to a living thing than a record. To be written in it was spoken of the way your kind speaks of a curse or a brand, something that followed a man and could not be lifted. There are accounts, and I grant that by this point legend and record have begun to braid together in the way they always do around the things your species needs to be true, of pirates who surrendered the instant they recognized her, not because they feared death but because they feared the book, who begged not to be written down, who offered to give back twice what they had taken if only their names could be left out. Raise the purser, by every account that reaches us, never once agreed. The writing was the point. The mercy was real, the lives were genuinely spared, the men genuinely walked away breathing. But the price of that mercy was the permanent record of having needed it, and that price, in that economy, was the most expensive thing in the world. I should tell you, because it is the part that most interests me as one who studies your kind from the outside, that the relationship between Del Carpio and the men she ruined was not simple hatred. This surprised me when I first traced it through the records, and it surprises your own historians when they notice it, which is rarely. Some of the men she spared sent her things afterward. Tribute, almost a cask of wine, a captured instrument, once a chart of waters she had not yet sailed. Not because they had forgiven her. A ruined man does not forgive the one who ruined him. I think it was something stranger and more human than forgiveness. I think that having been spared by her, having sat at her table and been treated not as a beast to be put down, but as a man to be released, some of them could not entirely hate her even as she destroyed them, and the tribute was the confused gesture of beings caught between gratitude and humiliation, feeling both at once and able to discharge neither. Your kind does this. You bind yourselves with peculiar loyalty to those who have power over you and choose not to use all of it. It is one of the things about you that I have never fully reduced to a principle, and I have stopped trying. I only record it. She was almost warm toward some of them, the records say, and they were almost loyal to her, and all the while the book on her table was quietly ending each of them as anything the world needed to fear. Warmth and ruin in the same hand. I have watched your species for a very long time, and I am still not certain you understand how unusual that capacity is. It was inevitable, given the arithmetic, that the story would come at last to Elia's marsh, because a legend cannot keep rising in a closed sea without eventually pressing against the man at the top of it. For years he had ignored her. This was, by the cold logic of his trade, the correct decision. She was a problem that diminished lieutenants and rivals, and a wise man does not interrupt his enemies while they are weakening each other. But reputation is a sea with only so much room in it, and as hers rose his necessarily fell, not because he had done anything wrong but because the men he relied upon to be frightened of him were spending more and more of their fear on her. A captain whose threats no longer empty a room is no longer a captain. Marsh felt the tide reaching his own feet, and he understood, being an intelligent man, exactly what it meant, that there were now two names on that water, and the sea would not long hold both. And so he did the thing he had built his whole life to do. He decided to take her himself, certain, the way men at the top of any order are certain, that he would be the one name her book could not hold. Here the record forks in a way that matters, and I will give you both branches because the difference between them is the difference between how your people governed and how this one woman did. While Marsh prepared to hunt her, the king's authority on those islands, a governor the documents named Don Rafael de Aguilar, had begun to take an interest in La Misericordia that was not entirely friendly. Aguilar wanted the pirates hanged. He wanted gibbets on the harbor mole and bodies in chains at the tide line, the old crude theater of state power, because he understood fear in exactly the way Marsh understood it and Del Carpio did not, as a thing produced by spectacle and corpses. And he resented, in the particular way that small men in large offices resent, that a woman was running her own justice on the king's own sea, filling a book with names instead of filling the gallows with the dead, making mercy where the crown wished to make examples. He summoned her. He instructed her that the next pirates she took were to be delivered to him for public execution. He reminded her, the documents suggest, that the sea belonged to the king and that the king's justice was death. She did not refuse him in words as far as the record shows. That was not her way, and a king's governor was not a man to be insulted across a table. She simply did not do it. When Marsh finally came for her, and he came in force, with more ship and more men than she had ever faced, certain that mass would solve what subtlety had not, she did to him exactly what she had done to every man before him, only with a deliberateness that suggests she had been waiting for him for years. The accounts of the engagement itself are frustratingly thin, as the accounts of her engagements always are, precisely because nothing dramatic enough to remember ever happened in them. That was the genius of her, that her victories left no wreckage for the storytellers to feed on. What we know is that Marsh's great assault resolved, as Crane's small one had years before, into Marsh himself sitting in the great cabin of La Misericordia, disarmed and unhurt and offered wine, looking at a woman who had taken the most feared man on the main without sinking so much as a longboat. And she wrote him in the book, that was all. She did not hand him to Aguilar's gallows, though delivering Elias Marsh to public hanging would have made her the most celebrated officer in the king's service and bought her anything she wished. To hang him would have been to make him, at the last, into exactly the legend he had always been, the great pirate who died defiant before a crowd, a story to frighten children with for a century. She understood that better than the governor ever could. She spared him. She fed him and his men and put them ashore alive with nothing. And in the book, in Ray's precise hand, beside the date and the place, she wrote that on this day Elias Marsh had boarded La Misericordia and had been spared. The most feared man on the Spanish Main, written into a parish register of mercy like a boy caught stealing apples, set free to walk into every port he had ever terrorized, and find that the story had arrived before him, and that the story was not that he had died bravely, but that he had been let go. There was no version of it he could tell that survived the telling. The man could not be killed by any weapon on that water. He was ended completely by an act of kindness and a line of ink, and he lived a long time afterward, which was the cruelest part, long enough to watch his name become first a joke and then nothing at all. I have spent a great deal of what you would call time turning this story over, and I want now to tell you what I think it means, because the meaning is the part your own people lost, and the meaning is the only part worth keeping. Your species is short-lived in a way that I think you do not fully feel from the inside, the way a fish, I imagine, does not feel the water. You are here and then you are gone, all of you, within a span that to my kind is hardly the length of a single considered thought. And because of this, because the body is so brief and so easily ended, I expected when I first began studying you that the thing you would fear above all others would be death, that everything in your societies would organize itself around the postponement of that one event. And in many ways it does. But the longer I watched, the more I came to see a stranger fear running underneath the obvious one, a fear that the men on that sea felt more keenly than they feared drowning. And it is this: you are afraid of being remembered wrongly. You are afraid of the story. A man like Marsh would have walked willingly onto a sword if the walking made a story worth telling, and he was destroyed instead by being kept alive inside a story he could not control. Because your lives are so short, the part of you that lasts is the telling of you, the name that goes on in other mouths after the brief body is gone, and to a creature built that way the corruption of the name is a deeper death than the death of the body. Ineacute's Del Carpio understood this about her own kind with a completeness I have rarely seen, and she built a weapon out of it. Not a weapon that took your one brief life. A weapon that took the longer life, the one made of words, the only immortality your kind has ever actually possessed. Consider what it required of her, and I do not mean the courage, though the courage was real. I mean the restraint, which is a far rarer and more difficult thing than courage, and which your histories almost never celebrate because restraint makes no noise and leaves no wreckage and gives the storytellers nothing to chew. Every man she captured she could have killed, and the killing would have been lawful, and the killing would have been easy, and the killing would have made her, in the eyes of the world, exactly the kind of fearsome that the world understood. The governor begged her to kill them. Her own age would have honored her more for a single hanging than for 1,000 pages of spared names, and she declined, again and again, for 19 years, not out of softness. The men she spared did not experience her as soft. They experienced her as the most ruinous force any of them ever met, but out of a clarity about what fear actually is and where it actually lives. She had grasped that the strongest hold a blade can have on a man is the strike it chooses not to make. A drawn sword commands only as long as it stays drawn. The moment it falls, its work is finished and its threat is spent. But a sword held back, deliberately and visibly held back, commands forever, because the man it spared must carry the knowledge of his sparing for the rest of his days, and that knowledge does more work than any wound. She kept her sword sheathed and filled a book instead, and the book outlasted every blade on that sea. There is a final thing the records show, and it is the thing that moves me most, in whatever way a creature like myself is moved. Consider what came after. The Governor Aguilar got his way in the end, as the crude usually do when they have the king behind them. After Del Carpio's time, the Crown's campaigns against the pirates grew larger and bloodier and far more conventional. Fleets sent out with orders to burn and hang, and they did burn and they did hang. Hundreds of men in chains at the tide lines of a dozen ports, the great theater of death that Aguilar had always believed in. And I have searched the archives with the particular care I reserve for the things your kind insists do not matter, and I can tell you that almost none of those hanged men are remembered. Not their names, not their crimes, not the spectacle that was supposed to frighten a generation. The corpses did their brief work and rotted and were forgotten, because a corpse is an ending, and an ending is the one thing a story cannot be built from. The Crown spent rivers of blood to be forgotten. And La Misericordia, the ship that never sank a vessel, the woman who never took a life, the book full of spared men, those your people still spoke of generations later, still argued over, still half believed and half doubted in the way your kind reserves for the legends that mean too much to let go of. She never killed, and so she was never finished, and so she was never forgotten. The mercy was the thing that lasted. It is almost always the thing that lasts, and it is almost always the thing your kind notices least while it is happening. That is the answer to the question your sailors never thought to ask, the question hidden inside the loud, easy story of guns and silver. They feared her, and they were right to, and they were wrong about every reason why. They thought a ship was dreaded for what it could destroy. She had understood something they were not slow enough, or clear enough, or perhaps simply not strange enough to see that on a sea where every man's only true possession was his name, the most terrible power was not the power to end a life but the power to keep one, and to write down forever the manner of its keeping. She never sank a single ship. She never took a single life. And exactly that is the reason that of all the captains who ever rode the Spanish Main, hers is the name no one was ever able to forget. The men she killed could have become legends. The men she spared could only become her ledger. She knew the difference. It is, I think, the whole of what she knew, and it was enough.